What if your deepest sensitivity wasn't a flaw, but a form of second sight? What if the thing you've been told makes you too emotional, too intense, or too much was actually a sign that you were born near the veil, the thin layer between the seen and unseen worlds? Most people walk into a room and notice the furniture. You walk in and feel the grief that no one speaks, the tension under the laughter, the silence between the words. You've always felt things others missed, but no one taught you what it meant. In fact, they called it anxiety, overthinking, or weakness. But what if it was neither? What if your body has always been an antenna, tuned to frequencies most people spend their lives trying to ignore? Carl Jung believed that some souls come into this world with deeper access to the unconscious, what he called the collective psyche. These people do not just feel personal emotions, they feel the field. They carry a sensitivity that is not ordinary, but archetypal. If you've ever cried for reasons you couldn't explain, walked away from a conversation feeling drained and unsure why, or sensed danger long before it arrived, you are not fragile, you are perceptive. You are reading something real, something others have been conditioned to numb. But here lies the danger. If no one teaches you how to use this sensitivity consciously, the very gift that connects you to truth can become the reason you lose yourself. Without grounding, you begin to absorb not just energy, but identities. You confuse your feelings with the collective mood. You shrink to avoid being too much. You take on roles that were never yours. In this way, the veil that once gave you sight begins to blind you. This journey is not about fixing who you are. It is about remembering what your sensitivity was meant for. You were never meant to be the emotional sponge of the family or the silent peacekeeper at work. You were meant to see beneath the mask and speak from that place. The veil is not a curse, it is a calling. If you were born near the veil, what danger are you most likely to miss? The answer lies in what happens when you stop sensing and start seeing. When sensitivity becomes conscious, it becomes vision. Let's explore. What happens when you've spent your whole life feeling everything, but never learned how to discern what's actually yours? This is the invisible wound of many highly sensitive people. You walk into a family gathering and smile, but inside you feel a sadness you can't explain. A friend vents about their marriage, and days later it is you who lies awake, burdened by their sorrow. You scroll through the news, and even though the stories are distant, your body tightens as if the grief of the world now lives in your chest. You assume you're anxious, you assume you're broken. But what if you've simply never been taught to separate your soul from the collective sea? Carl Jung once warned that when sensitivity remains unconscious, it does not guide you, it consumes you. Like a sponge left in dirty water, your inner world absorbs the emotional toxins of others without you even realizing it. And here lies the danger. The longer you absorb what is not yours, the more distorted your self-image becomes. You begin to think, maybe I'm just difficult, maybe I'm always the problem, maybe I'm too weak to handle life. But these thoughts are not clear. They are the voice of the collective shadow whispering in your mind, unchallenged and unfiltered. This confusion doesn't only manifest in emotions, it seeps into identity. The highly sensitive child who absorbs their parents' unspoken resentment may grow up believing they are a disappointment, even when nothing was ever said aloud. The woman who feels the unspoken expectations of her partner may contort herself into endless versions just to keep the peace, only to wonder later why she feels invisible. The man who unconsciously mirrors the tension of his workplace may feel a chronic fatigue that no medical test can explain. All these are examples of the same unseen phenomenon, identification with emotional energy that does not belong to you. In Jungian terms, this is the failure of differentiation, the ability to discern where you end and the world begins. Without this boundary, your psyche becomes flooded. Your sense of self weakens, and in its place rises a false identity shaped by emotional osmosis. You may find yourself performing roles you never chose: the fixer, the silent one, the always available friend. And the tragedy is not just in the roles themselves, but in how deeply you forget your original essence. So, how do you stop absorbing and start seeing with clarity? How do you reclaim what is yours when you've spent decades tangled in what never was? This is where healing begins. Not through denial or detachment, but through conscious witnessing, through micro moments of pausing and asking, "Is this mine?" Through rituals of return, journaling, breathwork, dreams that help you feel your center again. You do not have to reject your sensitivity, you only have to anchor it in truth. Have you been living with feelings that were never yours to carry? What if your anxiety, your exhaustion, your confusion were all signs, not of disorder, but of misattunement? And what would your life look like if your sensitivity were no longer a storm, but a compass? Let's continue. What if your sensitivity was never meant to be controlled, but translated? For so long, we've been taught to shrink our reactions, suppress our emotions, and mask our overwhelm. But trying to dull sensitivity is like trying to dim a lighthouse because its beam is too bright for the night. The problem isn't the light, it's the absence of training in how to aim it. Most people never learn how to live with this kind of inner intensity. Instead, they cope. They're numb. They shut down. But what if that sensitivity, when made conscious, could become the sharpest form of inner vision? In everyday life, this shift begins in small but powerful moments. You're in a conversation and feel yourself getting tight or reactive. Rather than spiraling into guilt or blaming the other person, you pause and ask, "What part of me is being stirred?" That micro check-in breaks the trance of emotional fusion. It invites awareness, and that awareness turns an emotional storm into a message waiting to be decoded. This is the first step in transforming unconscious sensitivity into conscious guidance. Without this step, emotions remain noise. With it, they become signals. Jung believed that what we repress becomes unconscious and eventually turns against us. But when we bring light to it, it becomes integrated into the personality. This is especially true for the highly sensitive. When you stop seeing your emotional waves as weakness and start treating them as encoded information, you shift from survival mode to symbolic mode. A tightening in the chest might reveal a boundary crossed. A flood of sadness might point to a value unspoken. A sudden anger may not be about this moment at all, but a cry from an unloved part of you. Can you imagine what your life would look like if each emotional spike became a sacred doorway instead of a problem to fix? Here's a real-life example. A woman in her 40s, once overwhelmed by her role as an emotional caretaker in her family, began journaling a single sentence every time she felt a strong emotion. At first, it was chaotic, but over time, patterns emerged. She realized that her so-called empathy often disguised her fear of being abandoned. By witnessing her triggers instead of collapsing into them, she found her voice. Not only did her panic attacks ease, but she also stopped apologizing for her needs. Her clarity didn't come from suppressing her sensitivity. It came from translating it. Another example, a man who had always considered himself emotionally too much began practicing what Jung called active imagination. sitting with the image that came to mind during emotional intensity and dialoguing with it. When stress arose, he saw a vision of a boy banging on a locked door. Rather than dismissing it, he asked what the boy wanted. The answer? To be seen. That inner vision became a turning point. He started making time each morning to ask himself what part of him needed to be witnessed before facing the world. Over time, his sensitivity stopped feeling like a curse. It became a sacred compass. So, how would your life change if, instead of pushing your feelings down, you started decoding them? What wisdom has your body been trying to share for years that your mind was trained to override? And if your sensitivity was never the problem but the portal, what truth is waiting on the other side of your attention? Clarity, for most, does not arrive in moments of ease. It appears after we've mistaken noise for truth one too many times. But if you are willing to listen differently, to see your emotions not as floods to escape, but as maps to follow, you begin to reclaim your inner authority. That is when sensitivity becomes sight, and that is where your real healing begins. What if the emotional storm you're in right now isn't a breakdown, but a breakthrough in disguise? It starts small. A constant fatigue you can't explain, a creeping sadness in the middle of what should be joy, or a quiet panic that seeps in during the silence of the night. You tell yourself it's just stress. Maybe it's the job, maybe it's the kids, maybe it's your age. But deep down, something sacred is unraveling. Carl Jung warned that what we call symptoms, anxiety, depression, burnout, are often signals from the soul that the ego is holding on too tightly to a life that no longer fits. Let's take a real example. A woman in her late 40s, recently divorced, with adult children who no longer need her in the same way, finds herself in a fog. She's not just mourning the end of a marriage, she's mourning the loss of who she was when she mattered to others. The roles she played, mother, wife, caretaker, are dissolving, and with them her identity begins to fracture. She wakes up one day and feels like a stranger in her own skin. The world hasn't ended, but something inside her has. And yet, no one around her seems to notice. She's praised for how well she's handling it, but inside, she is disintegrating. This is what Jung called the night sea journey, a descent into the unconscious where the surface self dies to make space for something truer. It is not pathology, it is an initiation. But here's the danger. If we don't recognize this descent for what it is, we try to fix it, medicate it, bury it under distractions. The culture offers surface solutions, spa days, new hobbies, affirmations, but the soul is not looking for relief. It is looking for rebirth. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming the self, only begins when the ego surrenders its illusion of control. That's why collapse is sacred. The anxiety that won't go away is often your unlived life knocking at the door. The depression is the soul withdrawing its energy from the false roles you've outgrown. And the restlessness? It's the hunger for something deeper, something real, something you. So what if your suffering is not a sign that you are lost, but a message that it's time to shed what is no longer aligned with who you truly are? What if this rupture is the psyche's way of cleansing your field so you can stop performing and start becoming? We are conditioned to treat discomfort as an emergency, but in the psyche's language, it's a rite of passage. Jung warned that if we avoid this passage, the unconscious will force it upon us through crisis, illness, or collapse. But if we choose to descend consciously, something miraculous happens. The pain becomes purposeful. The void becomes fertile. The unraveling becomes sacred. And so the question becomes, Are you willing to stop fixing yourself long enough to feel what's really asking to be felt? Can you pause the performance and listen for what the soul is, trying to say beneath the anxiety, beneath the sadness, beneath the silence? Your collapse is not a curse, it is a call. To answer it is to enter the most sacred initiation of your life. To cross this threshold, you need a map for the descent. Have you ever wondered why some of the most vivid dreams you've had involved falling, being underwater, or walking through endless tunnels? These strange symbols are not meaningless. In Jungian psychology, such imagery signals a descent, not into despair, but into the self. While modern culture encourages us to always rise, always strive, and always project confidence, Jung reminds us that true transformation requires going inward and downward. This descent is not regression, it is a sacred return. And it often begins when the outer world fails to reflect who we are inside. Imagine the woman who has done everything right, built a family, sustained a career, smiled through years of sacrifice, only to wake up in midlife with a hollow ache she cannot explain. Or the man who, after climbing the corporate ladder, begins to question if his achievements mean anything when silence falls at the end of the day. These are not breakdowns, these are summons. Life has stopped reflecting your inner truth, and the self begins calling you back. Jung saw these inner breakdowns not as pathology, but as an invitation. The self, buried beneath years of personas, roles, and expectations, begins to reclaim you. When you dream of basements, oceans, or being swallowed, the unconscious is offering you a symbol of initiation. These images carry the message, you are not who you think you are. You are more. The descent strips away false identity, but not to destroy you, to reroute you. Many people fear this process. It feels like disappearing. It feels like failure. But this is only true if we measure our worth by the surface. In truth, the descent is sacred. Jung called this the integration of the unconscious, the moment when you stop living only from the ego and begin to encounter the vastness of your own soul. And it is in this dark inner journey that you discover the self is not fragile. It is indestructible. It is the source of your real power. This descent can be disorienting. You may lose friends who only knew your surface. You may lose interest in goals that once drove you. But what you gain is clarity. You realize you are not here to perform. You are here to be, to remember what was buried, to let your soul breathe again. So the next time life takes you inward, through grief, through endings, through solitude, ask yourself, what part of me is being reclaimed? What identity is being dissolved so something more authentic can emerge? These questions are not theoretical, they are sacred keys. Because the descent to the self is not where the story ends, it is where your real life begins. What dream symbols have haunted or guided you? Have you ever felt swallowed by something deeper, only to emerge changed? Share your story below. Someone might need your truth. How can you hear your intuition when the world's noise keeps drowning it out? If you've ever walked into a room and instantly felt off, or sensed tension in someone's silence before words were spoken, you already know the quiet power of sensitivity. But without conscious boundaries, this gift turns against itself. Instead of discerning, you absorb. Instead of knowing, you carry. Jung warned that the unconscious, when left unexamined, doesn't just influence us, it possesses us. And for the sensitive person, this possession often comes disguised as empathy. Many people, especially in their 30s and 40s, begin to realize that their constant emotional exhaustion is not from doing too much. but from absorbing too much. A woman may spend her entire workday tending to others' needs, only to return home completely hollow. A man may find himself in a room full of people, yet feel invaded by 1,000 emotional undercurrents he cannot name. This is not a weakness. This is untrained intuition, and when left unchecked, it becomes emotional enmeshment. You lose your edge, you lose yourself. Carl Jung taught that intuition is one of the 4 primary functions of consciousness, but it must be honed. Without boundaries, your sensitivity becomes porous. You become like a sponge with no container. But with structure, your sensitivity matures into inner clarity. Instead of drowning in the emotions of others, you begin to sense your own emotional compass pointing north. This healing begins in the small sacred rituals of your day. Start your morning with a body scan. Ask your body, where do I feel tension? What is mine? And what might belong to someone else? At midday, track your emotional spikes, moments of sudden irritation, sadness, or anxiety. These spikes are not random. They are messengers from the unconscious, whispering where your boundaries were crossed. At night, write down your dreams. Dreams are the language of the psyche, offering clues to what your intuition already knows, but your conscious mind has not yet admitted. With these practices, your inner world becomes legible. You stop fearing your sensitivity. You begin to respect it. Like a skilled translator, you learn to read the language of your body, your dreams, your subtle reactions, and over time, what once felt like emotional chaos becomes refined insight. Ask yourself, where in my life am I still leaking energy because I have not drawn a clear line? What messages might my tension, my fatigue, or even my dreams be trying to deliver? You are not too sensitive. You are simply waiting for structure to turn your chaos into clarity. And with those boundaries in place, the real magic begins. You stop reacting and start responding from your deepest truth. What boundaries have helped you reclaim your energy? What small rituals reconnect you to your intuition? Share your practices below. Someone else might be searching for the same lifeline. Have you ever wondered why the more you try to fix everyone around you, the more drained and invisible you feel? Many sensitive people confuse presence with performance. They believe that love means overextending, that value means usefulness, and that to be good is to be endlessly available. But this pattern slowly erodes the self. Instead of being a soul with vision, you become a shadow of everyone else's needs. Carl Jung warned that when the persona takes over, we live in service to the image of who we think we should be, not who we truly are. And for many, this good person persona becomes a cage. You see it in families, especially in midlife, where the caretaker of everyone, whether a mother, a manager, or a friend, reaches a quiet breaking point. She has been the mediator, the giver, the glue. But inside, there is depletion, a feeling of being unseen, unheard, and unappreciated. It is not that she wants to abandon anyone, she just longs to be witnessed herself, not needed endlessly. This is where the mature shift occurs, from rescuing others to witnessing them. To witness is not to withdraw, it is to stay grounded in your center while observing clearly. It is to hold space for truth without rushing to control the outcome. Jung understood that the self, the center of our wholeness, cannot emerge through codependence. It rises in clarity, often through silence. When you become a witness, you allow others to take responsibility for their own growth. You become a mirror, not a savior. This shift transforms your relationships. In a friendship, it might mean not fixing your friend's spiral, but saying, "I see where you are, and I trust your wisdom to find the next step." In a family, it may mean holding steady when tensions flare, choosing not to absorb every storm. In a work team, it looks like naming the truth without blaming or over-explaining. These are not acts of passivity. They are acts of power rooted in the deep stillness of self. Jung said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents." Often we are trying to live for others instead of with them. But when you witness rather than rescue, you give others back the dignity of their own path. You do not carry their wounds. You walk beside them as they learn to heal. Ask yourself, where am I still confusing love with over-functioning? What would it mean to show up fully present without fixing, pleasing, or disappearing? This path is not easy. It requires you to sit with discomfort, to resist the urge to control, and to trust the process of others even when they stumble. But this is how meaning returns. When you stop overextending, your presence becomes cleaner, stronger, and more magnetic. People feel your rootedness. They feel safe around you, not because you save them, but because you see them. Have you ever made this shift, from fixer to witness? What changed in your relationships when you stopped rescuing and started truly listening? Share below. Your story might awaken someone else's turning point. What if your sensitivity was never meant to isolate you, but to refine you into a vessel for quiet transformation? After the descent into shadow, after the collapse of identity, and after the long path of inner witnessing, there comes a return. But this return is not a re-entry into the same life. You are not coming back to play the same role. You are coming back changed. This is where many people struggle. They ask, how do I go back to my family, my workplace, my old relationships after this deep inner work? And the truth is, you don't go back. You bring forth. You bring back a different frequency, one that does not need noise to be felt. Carl Jung taught that individuation is not escape from the world, but a transformation of how we move through it. You return carrying your center, not your chaos. In the past, your sensitivity may have made you reactive. Every shift in someone's mood, every unmet expectation, every guilt-laced conversation felt like a thread pulling you into obligation or emotional entanglement. You may have walked into rooms already adjusting yourself to avoid conflict or to keep the peace. But now, your sensitivity is no longer a wound. It is an instrument of perception, tuned not to fear, but to truth. There is a kind of power that does not announce itself. It does not need to speak first, nor be the loudest. It walks in silence and stillness, and yet everything around it subtly recalibrates. This is the energy of someone who has seen their shadow and does not flinch. Someone who has died to their persona and come back rooted in the self. They no longer need to prove anything. They are not swayed by flattery or shaken by rejection. Their presence is not performance. It is present. You become trustworthy, not because you say all the right things, but because your energy carries coherence. You listen without collapsing. You speak without aggression. You hold boundaries without drama. You don't need to withdraw from the world, but you no longer abandon yourself to stay in it. Imagine entering your next conversation from this place. Imagine showing up to an old pattern and realizing it no longer seduces you, not because you are guarded, but because you are grounded. This is what Jung meant when he said the goal is not perfection, but wholeness. You are no longer at war with yourself, so the world no longer has to mirror that war back to you. Now you can love from overflow, not obligation. Now you can connect without clinging. Now your story is not a trauma loop, but a myth in which the hero returned from the underworld carrying the flame of consciousness. So ask yourself, are you ready to return? not to who you were, but to who you truly are beneath the masks? What quiet revolution might begin simply by standing in a room fully you? Comment below if you've felt this shift. What changed when you stopped performing and started simply being? Let your story anchor someone else's return. If this touched something sacred inside you, don't let it fade into silence. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your presence here is not just support, it's resonance. And if you feel moved to give back, your donation becomes a quiet but powerful gesture that helps keep this light alive for others still walking in the dark.